start. Good evening, everyone. And first, I would like to ask each one of our members present here that could there be anything in common between investing and the environment? Well, eCube Investment Advisors feels there is. We have with us the chairman at eCube Investment Advisors Private Limited, Dr. Mukund Rajan. Dr. Rajan, welcome to the show. And if you recall, sir, we met at the Tata boardroom, and today you are with us as an entrepreneur. You are a great source of motivation and inspiration for all of us, Dr. Rajan.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Before we find out the connection between the environment and investing, I would like to introduce the founders of Millennium Mams, our founder mentor, Mr. Vishnu Dhanuka, and Mr. Sanjay Bhuwania. He'll be very soon joining us. They have found something in common between women and investing, and Millennium Mams was born 28 years and more than 5,000 women investors. Millennium Mams continues to empower women through investing. Investing has always been backed by fundamentals, integrating long-term impact on society. Environment and performance of a business is a novel way of looking at investing. Dr. Rajan has been with the Tatas for more than 23 years and has held different portfolios like Vice President, Chairman's Office, Tata Sons, Chairman, Tata Global Sustainability Council, and Chief Ethics Officer, Head of International Operations. All this is Dr. Rajan, and he's a chemical engineering graduate from IIT Delhi and has done his doctorate from the University of Oxford. And just as environmental awareness is vital to save the environment from further degradation, investing with ethics is also the need of the hour. Let's find out how it's done and add another dimension to our investing. Sustainability is the future. And here I would like to welcome and I would like to request Dr. Mukund Rajan to address us all on the importance of sustainability, investing, and ESG. Dr. Rajan.
Thank you very much, Rachna. Thank you. What I thought I'd do is maybe just start with a very quick introduction and maybe also connect some dots in my career leading up to my current interest in ESG investing. And then I'd love to get into a more interactive discussion with all of you. So we can take questions on.
Yes, and my colleague Sirisha, she will be moderating the Q&A for us. Sirisha.
Terrific.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon. Thank you. So just by way of quick background, as you rightly mentioned, we met a few years back in the boardroom of Bombay House, the Tata headquarters. I think I met on successive years, once when I was the brand custodian and then subsequently when I was working with Chandra as the Chief Ethics Officer and Chair of our Global Sustainability Council.
Yes.
And just to take you back to my days when I was still in college, you mentioned the University of Oxford. I actually did a master's and doctorate in international relations, but my specialization was actually in environmental politics. And I actually wrote a book based on my doctoral dissertation called Global Environmental Politics. And it was, at the time, probably one of the first detailed research studies on India's policy on climate change and global warming. So it's really that which started my interest in the whole space of environment. And then in my years at the Tatas, I was very, very fortunate to spend a lot of time with successive chairmen who really deeply believed in the importance of being environmentally conscious and indeed adjunct to that, obviously giving back to society. And then towards the end of my time in the Tatas, obviously the privilege of serving as the brand custodian, the chair of our Sustainability Council and Chief Ethics Officer, meant one had an opportunity to integrate a lot of the learning and experience going all the way back to my education and then the years in Tata's. So in 2018, when I left the Tatas, it was really to set up this new company called eCube. eCube, as the name suggests, is drawn from the three E's, engage and empower for ESG. And the sense that two of my colleagues and myself were the co-founders of eCube. All of us, by the way, have Tata backgrounds. Alan Rosling was for many years a Tata Sons director. Govind Shankar Narayan was one of the co-founders of Tata Capital, our group NBFC, and of course my own self. When we came together, we felt that India was really poised to see significant changes in the ESG landscape. And corporate India needed help and support in preparing for this transition. What were some of the key drivers behind really what was changing in the Indian firmament? I think two in particular that I'll call out, but many others as well. One is the greater focus on corporate governance. So in ESG, obviously the G is governance, the E and the S are environment and social. So we felt that corporate governance is beginning to get much greater attention and much more legislation that was actually empowering small shareholders, empowering customers, empowering lenders. I think there was this growing understanding that the economy was actually suffering because of the large NPAs that had built up in the banking system. Many of them the result of poor corporate governance in corporates that actually borrowed and then defaulted. So I felt that the time was right to shine a new light on the importance of corporate governance and help companies that wanted to do better in this space. The second big driver we felt was the growing concern around global warming. India, as many of you would know, is the third largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world after China and the United States. And interestingly, in this decade, in the 2020s to 2030, India will be the largest incremental contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. So there is going to be a huge amount of scrutiny of India's actions on trying to control its carbon emissions and in the role that corporate India plays in being much more environmentally friendly, much more climate friendly in its practices and processes. So we felt these were two important issues that are going to drive a lot of change. Parallelly, if you look at the international environment, there's obviously a huge amount of focus on these same issues. So there is a body called the United Nations, which has under it the Principles for Responsible Investment, the UNPRI. They actually have been advocating for asset managers to subscribe to ESG principles in the way in which they invest. And today, over $80 trillion worth of value embedded in funds have actually committed to the UNPRI principles. So that gives you a sense of how big this focus, this awareness has become outside of India. Another indicator, in the United States, there is a body called Business Roundtable, which includes all the large Fortune 500 companies that you can think of from the United States. So Apple, IBM, Microsoft, and so on. That body till last year used to subscribe to the notion that the primary responsibility of management and of promoters is really to create shareholder value. So they believed really in shareholder primacy, the old Milton Friedman view of the role of business. Last year, for the first time after, I think, 4 decades, they've actually altered this proposition to say that the commitment should really be in the direction of balancing the interests of all stakeholders, not just the shareholders, and of trying to address value creation opportunities for all stakeholders. So I think these are two illustrations of how important a broader sense of how value creation takes place in corporates, how it's becoming very important overseas. The third illustration I give is the European Union, where last year they've adopted a new directive which requires all asset managers, be it mutual funds, be it insurance companies, to really test their portfolios for ESG performance and to start reporting and disclosing this. I think this becomes very important for countries like India because many of these mutual funds and insurance companies are investing in India either directly or indeed giving mandates to Indian mutual funds and Indian insurance companies to invest on their behalf. So once they start asking for the compliance for proof evidence that the portfolio investments actually measure up to their ESG standards, I think there will be a big ask from Indian corporates to demonstrate that they are actually living up to these kinds of expectations. So I think across the spectrum, there is a movement that is pushing corporates in the direction of doing better on ESG performance. There's also a lot of academic research. One of our advisors at eCube is one of the global authorities on ESG investing. His name is Professor George Serafeim of the Harvard Business School. And he's demonstrated that companies that embrace an ESG improvement trajectory early on in their evolution actually tend over time to outperform the market benchmarks. And it's really some of his learnings and his research in developed markets that we are now trying in eCube to demonstrate also will work in a market like India. And going back to my many years in the Tata Group, I can certainly say that Tatas are, I think, a very good illustration of long-term value creation, trying to balance the interests of multiple stakeholders. So not just shareholders, but also the community, also the employees, taking on board your responsibilities for the natural environment, being a responsible citizen, paying your taxes on time. All of this matters. And it is therefore a company like Tata's that has managed to survive so long, over 150 years, and actually succeed for much of this period, doing fairly well across its businesses. So I think there are a number of examples of companies that have embraced this logic that ESG is important and that you have to take a spectrum of stakeholders on board when you're actually planning your strategy as a corporate. And I think more and more investors are now looking for evidence that companies understand the importance of ESG, are mitigating risks on each of these elements, taking note of what the future requires from them, and therefore planning appropriately for that. I think, and this will be the last thing I'll say before I stop to take questions, I think the current situation with COVID, where we've seen that many corporates have been, in a sense, found out for a number of issues. Many corporates have not had strong enough balance sheets. They don't have adequate cash reserves. They aren't able to see through more than a few weeks of a lockdown. Many of them have resorted to cost reduction measures that have entailed a great deal of pain and hardship for their employees. A number of them have got rid of contract workers. Many of them have displaced people who've eventually become the migrant labor that all of us have suddenly woken up to the reality of. All of this shows that, when crisis suddenly hits you, a lot of corporates are unprepared. And there are huge risks that are building up in the system if companies don't take their responsibility seriously. I think ESG investing is merely an effort to try and put an appropriate lens on how companies need to de-risk for the future and prepare to better address the needs of all their stakeholders in order to be successful for the long term. So with that quick opening remarks, let me
Yes, Dr.
take whatever questions you have on Tata's, on eCube, the Indian environment, and what's happening overseas.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. Thank you so much for throwing light on the importance of being environmentally conscious. And Dr. Rajan, before I hand over to Sirisha, I would like to ask a question that the present situation, COVID-19, it signals that we need to shift to responsible investing. So does that mean a change in mandate for all non-ESG funds?
I think the expectation is that all funds pretty soon will have to build into their protocols, into their planning, into their strategies, ESG metrics and measures. Now, having said that, there is still going to be significant space for people to have differentiated strategies. And indeed, there will be some funds, I can assure you, that will probably take the easy way out and not place too much sort of focus, at least in the early years, on some of the requirements that you would imagine normally you should have if you have an ESG investing lens. Let me give you an example. A lot of ESG investors today will automatically eliminate industries that are very high on fossil fuel usage on the basis that these are significant contributors to climate change, significant risks involved if you continue to be reliant on fossil fuel consumption. And there'll come a time when perhaps a lot of the investments you make may become stranded assets. So there will be people who won't invest in coal, who won't invest in thermal power, for instance. Likewise, if you look at some of those sort of sin stocks, tobacco, gambling, these are spaces that a lot of ESG investors won't touch. But it doesn't mean that these industries don't get funded. Thermal power gets funded, coal gets funded. The question is how long this will continue and at what point there may be a significant shift of investor interest away from some of these businesses on the basis that these have very high risks embedded in them. So I think investors will have to make their own call, but my sense is that most funds will gravitate towards at least some basic fundamental principles around which they would like to focus their investing activity. And that will include a core that will be very strongly aligned with ESG. And by the way, the most important part of ESG, and there's academic research to demonstrate that also, is corporate governance. If you had to push me to give a percentage, though it would not be right to do that, I would say that 70% of ESG is all about governance. If you get your governance right, you will pretty soon have the right protocols, the right metrics for measure, the right strategies to also deal with your impact on the environment and with your need to carry society and the social issues in society along with you. So I think eventually all investors will move in that direction, but you can't discount that there will be some differentiated strategies initially. That may also imply some investors not paying much heed to many of the ESG requirements, at least to start with.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. Sirisha, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Rachna. Thank you, Dr. Rajan. That was very insightful. I must say this is the first time that we are having a presentation on a topic like this. So a heads up is that you may get repeated questions because the concept is completely new to us. So my question is that, I quote from your interview that your funds are backing small and medium cap companies that are led by visionary promoters who have serious intent to improve their ESG performance. My question to you, sir, is, on the working model of ESG, is that are you, taking any burden off their shoulders? Are you giving them more to do?
I think it's going to be a little bit of both. I think promoters understand that, if you want to plan for the future, there are probably going to have to be some significant investments with an eye on the long term. But interestingly, a lot of the initial investment is not so much of financial resources. It's more of just getting your measurement systems in place and being able to report better. The low-hanging fruit, very often, and this has been seen in academic research, is really to try and get better disclosures happening to the investor community. So that people understand that A, you understand your responsibilities, B, you have a strategy in place to address those, C, you have the right kind of plan and it's going to work out over a period of time. Once people get that reassurance, I think they start believing more in the company. The actual financial investments, if they are required, and sometimes they're not required, sometimes it's just a question of fixing maybe the corporate governance in a company. But sometimes it could be trying to be ahead of the curve on environmental regulation and making some capital investments that are necessary. So sometimes it'll be the case, sometimes it's not. But as long as you're able to demonstrate that you understand what competitive success entails and that you're planning for it and you're making the right disclosures that allow people to actually evaluate what you're trying to do and benchmark it with the best of breed, then you start getting a lot of recognition from investors for that. So the low-hanging typically is just better measurement. A lot of companies surprisingly don't actually know, what is a carbon footprint, what is a water consumption. So these are simple things that they can put in place protocols to measure and to start disclosing better. And obviously the smaller the companies get, which is why we felt at EQ we'd focus on the mid-market, these are the companies that often need help. They want to do the right thing, but they don't know where to go for support. And therefore, with a lot of our Tata background and the networks we have, we could bring together the right kind of operating partners, provide them the right advice that's relevant for their industry, and give them a sense of what domestic and global best practices might look like. And then they get onto a journey. And that journey won't see results overnight. It's a period of time. It'll take 5 to 7 years typically before you start seeing the most significant outcomes of a strong ESG strategy.
Thank you, sir. Can I bring in Srinidhi, please?
Thank you, Sirisha.
Yeah.
Good evening, Mr. Rajan. My question is that adoption of, what I understand is adoption of ESG would translate into easier fundraising for a company. So, but as investors, so when we look at ESG, so how much importance should we give to ESG? And so does it vary from sector to sector, the ESG score for companies?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. It does definitely vary from sector to sector. There is this concept called materiality, which has become very important in the world of ESG investing. So for each industry, you have to try and check for what is truly material to the success of that industry. I gave you the example of thermal power, for instance. A coal-fired thermal power, which relies heavily on fossil fuel like coal for production of energy, is obviously going to be very challenged in the environment in the future because of climate change and global warming. And what will be very material is obviously the carbon emissions in that industry. On the other hand, if you were in a service industry, take IT for instance, chances are the carbon emissions is a much smaller part of the ESG metrics that you want to really track. Maybe you're interested in issues around the diversity quotient and so on. So from industry to industry, it will vary, and what is material to each industry is unique perhaps to that industry. There is a body called the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, that actually has brought out some very good analysis of what are the material metrics for each industry. So typically, if you're an investor, you don't need to churn the ocean, but you need to be aware of the 4 or 5 key metrics that you think are going to impact the success and the fortunes of companies in each industry vertical, and then try and check whether those particular metrics are being addressed adequately, are being addressed responsibly by the companies that you want to invest in. So that would typically be the way in which you would go about it.
Thank you so much.
Namita, can you come in with your question?
Good evening, Dr. Rajan.
Hi.
Sir, actually, I wanted to know, and I'm a little curious about this, how different would an ESG fund be from the components of any large, cap fund, which I presume would also, where all these factors would play a very important role, because you said 70% is governance. So they'll also have a very tight kind of metrics to in terms of their mandate. So can you just help elaborate a little bit more in terms of that?
No, you're quite right. I think a lot of large caps are hopefully, we've seen enough that have also floundered, but hopefully reasonably well governed. Many of them in India are increasingly international, or certainly part of international supply chains, and therefore they are under scrutiny and under pressure from their supply chain partners to adhere to strong ESG practices. Many of them have international investors who have started at least asking the questions around their ESG performance. So you're quite right. I think that many of the large caps probably have a reasonably good story to begin with, which by the way is one of the reasons at EQ we felt we would not focus on large caps for 2 reasons. One, many of them already know what they require to do. The other is, of course, the not invented here syndrome, that many large caps don't feel they need any advice. They think if they need advice, they'll go to some of the best consultants and do it themselves. But they're not really likely to respond to pressure from outside. Whereas the small and mid caps, many of them need help. They need support. They want to do the right thing. They don't know where to go. So you're quite right that many of the large cap funds, you could imply that there is probably a reasonably strong ESG quotient that operates across their investments. But again, there have been, as I said at the start, a number of large caps that very quickly have spiraled out of control and gone bust. If you look back, I think globally, some of the best examples have been companies that for a period of time were, the stars of the investing world. Take a company like Enron. It took less than a year for it to go from being right at the top of the league tables to becoming everyone's favorite example of rotten corporate governance and completely letting down their shareholders. So things can change very fast. So companies that on the face of it, just because they're large cap, I would not assume that they have necessarily a powerful ESG story. As you probe deeper, as you scratch the surface, you start finding out what could be some of the challenges many of these companies will face. And for that, I'd again go back to what are the material ESG metrics and probe further. I think it's very interesting that even India's largest private company, Reliance Industries, private sector company, found it necessary in this year's AGM to talk very strongly, and I thought quite powerfully, about the need to move towards a zero carbon world. And this for a company that's been refining fossil fuels for the longest time as the biggest part of its profitability and success, I think tells you a lot that even the largest companies are now feeling obliged to tell their story better and to present the way in which they're going to get to that new future, which is going to be very different from their past. So I would not take anything on face value. I would question, and I would scratch the surface.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan.
Sunanda, can you come in with your question?
Actually, Dr. Rajan, you partly touched on that when you spoke of Reliance talking about a zero carbon footprint. So when you spoke about energy companies and fossil fuel companies and they becoming a little taboo because of the pollutants they release, some time back there was a news report that BP said that they would become a zero carbon company in a few years' time. Now, to me, how is it possible for any fossil fuel company or company dealing with petrochemicals to do something like this? It seems a little absurd. So, I mean, it's just very logical that the product they are dealing with is a pollutant and it is used. So, I mean, how is this related to ECG?
So I think the quick answer would be technology and two possibilities. One is what is called carbon capture and storage. So if you can find a way to actually capture the carbon emissions and repurpose them, because carbon is used in a lot of industries and could be repurposed for different ways of delivering energy without additional carbon output. So that is one whole space. Some people also talk about some crazy technology where you can sort of embed the captured carbon and essentially bury it under the sea.
So, yeah.
It's a bit like the way you deal with spent nuclear fuel. So there are those kinds of options. We have to test each of them as they become more commercially viable to see whether they're really answering the problem or they're a little bit of a red herring. The other possibility is offsets. So if you're creating carbon emissions in one place, can you offset it by, for instance, planting large amounts of forests? By the way, in India's own strategy, under what are called the NDCs, the Nationally Determined Contributions towards the Paris Climate Treaty of 2015, we've said we're going to do three things. We said we are going to improve the energy efficiency of the economy by 33 to 35%. We said that we're going to create 40% of our power production from renewables, both these by 2030. And we've also said, interestingly, we're going to create 2.5 billion tons of carbon capture through deforestation. So in a sense, we are also hedging our bets and saying there's going to be a combination of offsetting strategies and ways of mitigating or curbing our greenhouse emissions by moving to more environmentally friendly practices. So I think for some of these companies, it will be a bit of that also. But you're quite right that at the end of the day, one has to sort of again, not take any of this on face value. We have to check and test that it is a genuine answer and solution for the long term, rather than just words that are being bandied about.
So while you're on this, is there any example of a company that has moved from non-ESG to ESG? Any example of a particular company that has moved in your,
So I won't say non-ESG, because every company at some level is doing something on environment or on social issues or governance. But my favorite example, and in fact, we have an interview with Harsh Mariwala on our eCube website, is Marico. Because if you look back 20 years, at that time, Marico was a relatively small company, family-run business, many family members on the board. Corporate governance was a little bit,
yes,
question mark. Is this a typical family business where family decisions matter more than what is in the professional interest of the company? Harsh Mariwala, after he took over and sorted out the board composition, many family members stepped off the board, brought in a professional CEO, professionalized the management, started focusing quite a lot on sustainability practices, because a lot of the output in oils, for instance, was drawn from the agriculture space, and therefore they started making investment, better research and technology, research and development on seed hybrid varieties, on investing in farmers, educating them, giving them more confidence about the future, long-term contracts. All of those investments have paid off. So 20 years back, where Marico maybe had 1/10 to 1/15 of the typical valuation metrics on a like-to-like basis compared to, let's say, Hindustan Unilever, these days there have been quarters where they've actually done better than Hindustan.
right.
So that's actually the best example of a company where, if you put a rupee in 2000, it would be worth dramatically more than anything that the benchmark indices would have delivered over the last 20 years. And Marico today is a very, very successful company.
Yes.
So many companies that have taken these issues seriously, and many of them have done it because there's been an inner conviction that it makes a difference, it reduces your risk. In a number of cases, it also reduces costs. If you have longer term arrangements with reliable, trusted supply chain partners, you can often get your costs down. And particularly in down cycles, having those strong, trusted relationships actually helps your business. So I think there are many businesses like Marico that have done very well on these parameters.
Right. Thank you, sir. It's very interesting you tell this, because just 2 days ago, we had Harsh Mariwala on our platform. So.
Are you kidding me? I see. Very nice.
So, yeah. Sonali Chanda, can you come in with your question?
Yes. Good evening, sir. My question is, with the expertise you gained after working over 2 decades with Tatas, you would be judging management in a far superior way than us investors. So what parameters do you look at when deciding to go with an investment?
I think for us, the most critical element ultimately in an ESG platform is going to be promoter intent. You will obviously look for all the other measures of performance, of credibility over time, etc. But I think promoter intent on ESG is for us very important, because in India, we've had so many tragic stories of investors being misled, because a lot of very sharp promoters will tell you what they think you want to hear, but they may or may not mean it seriously. And it's after you made the investment that you discover whether they're going to live up to promises or not. So how do you test for promoter intent? And I think there are 2 or 3 ways in which you can do it reasonably efficiently. One is you look at oversight in the company. If something is important, if something is material, who is in charge of actually delivering on that issue? Is it some lowly functionary, or is it right at the top of the company, from the promoter to the management, the board? Everyone is involved and they're speaking the same language. So that's very important to check, where does this actually come from? And is there evidence from the past to show that there has been seriousness? Second, you look for a strategy. Is there anything documented or otherwise in public statements and press conferences that people have been saying that suggests there is a genuine commitment? And third is the functional integration. Very often we think, take environment, one of the elements in ESG, that environment is only the responsibility of somebody who may be an environment officer or a sustainability officer. And none of the other departments have any clue what the company's targets or plans are. Then that's a big problem. It shows that across the organization, you don't have functional integration. None of the other parts of the business understand the expectation, in which case you really have a problem. So what you really want to test for and check is the finance department, is the HR department, are they all singing the same tune? Are they all equally committed? Are issues around sustainability, if it's important for the company, being built into the KRAs and the way in which senior leadership is compensated? Does CEO pay depend on it? Is the board tasking them to do better? That's what you check for. And if you get a sense that all of this, it may not all be in place, but at least the language suggests that they're moving in that direction, then you have much greater confidence that yes, these promoters mean what they say, and we can take a bit of a risk and bet on them. But if you don't see any of this, then it's probably just people mouthing platitudes, and they may not really be very serious about delivering once they've taken your money.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Sonali Sonpal, can you come in with your question?
Yeah. Sir, my question is related to CSR. 2014, like CSR was made mandatory in India. So do you think like something has to be made mandatory for India to, kind of implement it? And another thing, has it helped, corporates take up responsibility in uplifting communities? And if you can draw an example from developed countries, any good example which we can implement here.
Okay, so actually CSR is one space where probably India is actually ahead of the curve. I think when the legislation was first being discussed as part of the amendments to the Companies Act, I think there was a lot of skepticism. Many people in the corporate world would say that this is just one additional tax. Why doesn't the government just take 2% of our profit as additional tax and spend it the way they think appropriate? It's a bit stupid to ask corporates to try and spend this money. But I think over time, many corporate... Apologies, I had a power outage. Can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Rajan.
Okay, I hope it doesn't happen again in the next 20 minutes. Bear with me if it does, I'll reconnect. I'm in a part of the country where both power and broadband are a little bit iffy.
Oh, okay. No problem.
So I was just responding on that question on CSR, and when the legislation first came out, I think many Indian companies were a little upset, and they felt that this is just an additional imposition. But I think over time, people have recognized that there is value to be had from this kind of legislation. It offers options for companies to collaborate, to pool in their CSR funds, and to really deliver significant value, particularly for the communities around the places where they operate. I've seen that in many spaces, for instance, in Tata's and skills development, we had partnerships with organizations like Siemens and Schneider, which worked really well for all concerned. Similarly, in the retail industry, many Tata companies that play in retail banded together and were able to actually make significant investments in skill development and bring together pools of talent that work for all the companies eventually. So I think it's a good idea. I think it's important in reminding corporate leaders that they have a responsibility to the community. And in particular, in a country like India, where you have so much poverty, and where frankly, corporates are used to government mandates. The biggest example perhaps is the whole space of reservations for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities. 26% reservation that's been there, constitutionally mandated for over 6 decades. And I think companies have learned to live with this. And it's important because you are trying to address historic injustice, historic discrimination, and inequality in society. So in a very poor country like India, I think such legislation does have value, does have meaning, and reminds corporate leaders that they have to demonstrate a corporate and social conscience. And 2% of net profits is a pretty small amount, I think, to contribute. What I would, however, like to see, and this is something you asked what other countries have done better, In the United States, for instance, there's a huge amount of pro bono contribution. So contribution of time and talent by employees. And in the Indian CSR legislation, this is not actually recognized or given value. So if, for instance, as part of your 2% contribution, you were allowed to value the time and talent of your employees and allow them to take up pro bono projects for nonprofits, I think a lot of companies would find that very interesting. And that's a space where perhaps we can evolve some of the legislation to allow more employees to come forward. Because it's when employees en masse start volunteering and giving their time and talent to address social issues, social causes, that you actually then genuinely get corporates to be more committed and more serious about the need to do something for the community. Otherwise, if it's just something that stays as a bee in the bonnet of a few directors on the board and the CSR committee of the board, it's not going to spread very much. So I'd like to see an amendment to the legislation. When I was in Tata's, I was part of a CII committee, which actually made this recommendation that pro bono contribution by individuals should also be given some value. You can cap it if you want as part of the overall CSR contribution, but you must encourage people to step out and give part of their time. And it was that also which led to our creation of a very strong employee volunteering program in Tata's, which in consecutive years delivered over 1 million hours of volunteering and a large number of pro bono projects that our people took up with nonprofits. So that's one space where I think there can be some perhaps improvement or tweaking of the CSR legislation.
Thank you, sir.
Sushila, can you ask your question?
My question is on NEP. With the new education policy coming into place, how will the idea of business professional and people from experience feel teaching students impact their education and vocational training? Will it be better than the regular one-sided lecture that we used to get?
So you've caught me completely off guard on that one because I've not studied the legislation very closely.
Okay.
The one part of, at least it's not yet legislation, I guess it's a proposed policy and it's up for commentary. But the one part that I did notice linking up to my previous responses, vocational education from standard 6 onwards. And I think that's actually great because, if young people are very good at different vocations and you can stimulate that passion, that interest from an early age, many of them can become entrepreneurs, can be participants in self-help groups. They don't need to necessarily look for going through the entire run of, 10 plus 2 plus 4 or 3 and then go into the workforce. There's a lot of wasted talent that has better capabilities and we don't encourage that. So putting too much emphasis on college education or on learning by rote or learning what's in the books, as opposed to giving people experiential learning, an opportunity to figure out what skill sets they may have an aptitude for, I think it's a very good idea. Now, I don't know if that at all addresses your question, but I'm very happy to understand a little better what you had in mind and then give you the benefit of my opinion. Not that I'm an expert in education.
No, but you can never be caught off guard when it comes to education. I reassure you that. Right. Can Priyanka come in with her question here?
Hello, sir. Sir, I want your view on the post-COVID world. Also, what do you think this crisis will change socially and economically for the society and companies also?
Sure. So I think at one level, we've had a little bit of a dress rehearsal for what could happen with extreme climatic events and the whole climate change, global warming threat that humankind faces. We've seen that when humankind is faced with a major calamity, governments are willing to do whatever is necessary to address those threats, from completely locking down economies and being willing to take trillions of dollars in costs. Now, if 8 months back, before COVID hit us, if you had said the same thing about addressing climate change, you probably wouldn't have received a very receptive audience. If you'd said, let's spend $5 trillion in the next 1 year on addressing the threat of climate change and global warming, probably, as Greta Thunberg has discovered, quite often to her cost, a lot of people would laugh you out of the room. But today, I don't think that's the case anymore. I think COVID has shown us that when the threat is large enough and it looks imminent, governments are willing to do whatever it takes. So I think the corporate world is also reading the writing on the wall. If global warming is going to be the next big challenge, you don't want to get caught unprepared and off guard the way you were with COVID. As I said right at the start, many companies didn't have financial reserves, didn't know how to respond to the threat, couldn't take a lockdown of more than a few weeks in their stride, had to resort to all kinds of measures which actually leave them much weaker for the future, including laying off people and so on. So I think this time around they'll prepare better. And I think they're going to take these emerging issues much more seriously in the future. One concern that some people have expressed is government has also discovered how powerful it can be. There's been a question even about whether some of these lockdowns were really necessary, the continuing ones, short-term ones. And there's obviously in a country like India, all the associated issues of corruption and some people making some profit as a result of some of these restrictions. But be that as it may, I think at least in a democracy, you have a voice, the media will comment on some of these issues. The judiciary, after a fair amount of prodding, finally took up the issues of migrant labor. So I think things eventually turn around. So I think on the whole, it's been, I think, an experience that has taught us a lot, has given us some of the instruments which will be very helpful the next time we have another pandemic or other serious global issues. In terms of the ways in which corporates will respond, I think the most obvious one is the criticality of digital infrastructure and having digital capability across your operations. And the second is the whole premise around where your employees, where your operations, where your supply chain should be located. And if you want to build back better, build back faster, you don't necessarily need to incur many of those costs. You probably want to have a more localized supply chain. You don't want to be depending on remote locations that are suddenly inaccessible. And your people can work from home, saving you costs, but also creating new opportunities, particularly for women in the workforce. I think in the past, we've all seen that the whole idea of having more women in the workforce in India has suffered for a variety of reasons. But the minute you create conditions where people can work from home, there will certainly be additional stresses, certainly on women, but at the same time, it creates new opportunities for them to participate and to contribute and to be very productive. So I think hopefully we'll see some shifts in the ways in which companies have addressed particularly the S of ESG, particularly gender diversity, and carrying their people better with them in the future, having learned the lessons from COVID.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Preeti, can you come in with your question? We'll take last 3 questions. Preeti, are you there?
In the meantime, Meghna can come.
Yeah.
I am there.
Yeah.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Meghna, come in. Oh, who's coming in?
Okay, Preeti is there. Let her finish.
Preeti, Preeti, come.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. Sir, ESG investment is more about responsible investment and aligning your investments with your value system. So, sir, do you think is our country ready for such kind of investments?
So I'd be a little careful to say it's alignment with value system because it's not necessarily that. I mean, values could be very different. But it certainly is pushing the agenda forward on tasking companies to understand what is material to their industries and reporting and disclosing better. And then progressively raising the benchmark over time. And where you see that companies are committed on this path, I think you can feel reasonably confident that you're backing the right kinds of companies. Values, I think, can vary from individual to individual and different individuals, if you talk about individual investors, may have different value system, which may or may not coincide with what companies are all about. But as long as they are committed to, addressing the material ESG issues in that particular sector and have a way in which they are actually outperforming competition, I think you're backing the right horse. Sorry, was that your question, or did you have something else in mind?
No, you hit it right there.
Yeah, okay, great.
Thank you, sir.
Sarin, can you come in with your question? And then we'll go forward to Meghna.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. You have touched upon corporates. Now I'm raising the responsibility of ESG government. But my question is, how does India stand in terms of ESG measures globally? Where does India stand?
As a country?
As a country, sir.
I think terrible is the short answer. I'll just give you a few sort of examples. Take E first. In every parameter, whether it's air, water, or land, we have probably some of the worst environmental quotients in the world. There are WHO studies that indicate that 14, depending on which study you look at least 14 of the top 15 most polluted cities in the world in terms of air pollution are in India. We are all aware of the issues in the capital city of Delhi every year, whether it's through crop stubble burning or the traffic on the roads and so on. If you look at land degradation, the government's own statistics indicate that I think it's 90 million hectares out of a land mass of 320 is degraded. And we are one of the largest victims of desertification. Similarly, if you look at water, I think the United Nations has done a study which suggests that 12 of the Indian cities are going to run out of groundwater reserves by next year. We've seen the issues that a city like Chennai faces year on year. And in 2015, they had floods. In 2019, they had no water in the city. So we've got these huge challenges in environment. On social, we've got one of the lowest ratios of women in the workforce. Depending on whose numbers you look at, there's a World Bank study which suggests 17%. There are other studies that suggest 24%. But wherever you are on that range, it is substantially lower than most other countries, including many countries in this part of the world. We need to get many more women into the workforce, and doing that will actually get your GDP up by a huge percentage if you can get even a 10 or 20% uplift the numbers of women who join the workforce and then stay in the workforce, very importantly. Similarly, the issues around our treatment of Dalits and Adivasis, the requirement for SC/ST reservation is simply because there's been so much prejudice and discrimination that many of these communities are even today very backward compared to some of the forward communities. And that's the reason the reservation continues. So I think we have much to answer for, and the poverty of this country says a lot about the quotient of S. And then on G, I don't have to tell you, I mean, the NPAs in the banking system, and now with COVID, it's going to probably get much worse. But last year, it was 9 lakh crore rupees of NPAs. This year, it's anybody's guess where it's going to get to. And over 10,000 cases till 2019 were admitted before the insolvency and bankruptcy courts. Many of them, the consequence, not of bad luck, not of a bad business cycle, but just poor corporate governance. And promoters who've, resorted to very bad tactics to really gyp the banking system. So unfortunately on ESG, India's been, I think, a terrible story. The good news though, is that many of the measures to address all of this are now being put in place, and there is much greater awareness. So a lot of the questions, including the previous question on investors and responsible investing, I think now individuals are much more conscious, much more empowered, have much more information. Disclosures are far superior to what they used to be and are being improved year on year. I think SEBI has done a good job of asking for more disclosure. Now we need many more entities to actually monitor the disclosures that are being made. I'll give you an example. the business responsibility reports the top 500 listed companies are supposed to produce. SEBI has now increased that number to the top 1,000 listed companies. But if you look at the quality of the business responsibility reports, on average, I'd give them a C minus on a D to A scale. So there is a huge scope for people now to start entering that space and comment on the kind of reportage and disclosures companies are making, to name and shame the worst ones, so people start pulling up their socks. So I think we are slowly but surely getting more empowered. And frankly, I think there'll be a lot more change that comes in the next 2 or 3 years, significantly pushed by foreign investors because of all the pressures in their home markets. I mentioned the European Union directive, the changes in the United States, the PRI push. So I think all of this is going to force change in India as well. We are the mechanism of foreign institutional investors and foreign portfolio investors. So I think change is coming, it's coming fast, and all of you, I think, have a very important role to play in making sure that the momentum is maintained and in fact given significant plus.
Thank you for that candid answer, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. Can I call in Meghna for the final question?
Yeah. Good evening, Dr. Rajan. So firstly, I'd like to compliment you that you have penned your book, Brand Custodian, My Years with the Tatas, beautifully, sir. It was really a super read, sir. And sir, I wanted to ask you if you could please share the most important learning for you from your long association with the Tata Group, sir.
There were lots of learnings, so it'll be hard to, but maybe 2 I'll pick out.
Sure.
Interesting. One was when I was a rookie and I'd gone to meet Mr. Ratan Tata for my first formal interview with him just before joining his office and working with him then for the next decade and more. And I told him that I hope he was aware that I didn't have a MBA degree. I'd done a master's and doctorate, but it had nothing to do with business administration. And his response, I will never forget. He said, all you need is good common sense. That for me was hugely reassuring, that even though I didn't have an MBA like many of my young peers, but this man who was the helm of India's largest industrial empire felt I didn't need an MBA, all I needed was common sense. So that I'll never forget. The second was the time when I was the managing director of one of our listed telecom companies, a company called Tata Tele Maharashtra Limited. And that gave me an opportunity to work with a very young workforce. We had close to 3,000 employees. The average age would have been just around 30. And I think understanding and relating to the passion, the energy, the enthusiasm that young people have, and the ways in which they wanted to embrace the telecoms revolution to do something really dramatic in India. Huge number of new products that we launched at that time. And of course, that was the growth phase of Indian telecoms, unlike the situation we perhaps have today. Every month we were delivering better revenues, more subscriber additions. So it is a very enjoyable period of my life. And one thing I remember people sort of told me they remembered for many years later was me telling them that each one of them, I was also young, I became a CEO at 39. Each one of them, I would say, was also a CEO in waiting. And in fact, many of them were already CEOs in the way in which they were conducting their affairs. So they had responsibilities perhaps at home to their families, they had responsibilities to their teams. And I said, the concept of a CEO doesn't sort of stop or get capped at any point. Each one of you is in your own right a leader. You're leading other human beings. There are lots of people who are dependent and reliant on you for their future welfare. You have a huge ability to influence the future. So never forget that, and never be envious, and never be conscious that you are not here designated the CEO of a company. Anybody with good common sense can become a CEO. So
that is very inspiring. Thank you so much.
That's so inspiring, Dr. Rajan. And Dr. Rajan, I won't miss this opportunity. One last question.
Certainly, please.
When Dr. Mukund Rajan is not engaging or empowering for ESG, what is he doing?
That's again a tough question, because I'm sort of thinking about these issues. I've in fact just submitted the first draft of my next book, on corporate responsibility.
Yes.
Those of you who've written a book or written a thesis will know that you're constantly living with the subject.
Yeah.
There's never a moment when you're not sort
So
of
how
thinking.
do you unwind, Dr. Rajan?
Well, I love movies.
Wow.
I'm very grateful for new technology introductions through OTT.
Wow.
So Netflix, Amazon.
Yes, absolutely. We are all surviving on that.
There's some brilliant work, and some of the new Indian productions are amazing. Very professional, very slick. It's not like the old days where.
Even Mr. Dhanuka is a movie buff. Yes, sir.
Oh, wonderful. So that's great. Absolutely. So that takes my mind off things, and also listening to soft music, old Hindi songs. I love all of that.
Wow. Wow. So that brings us to the end of the session, although we all want to just, continue asking questions because it was so insightful, like, a lot of takeaways from this session, I would say. And thank you so much, Dr. Rajan, for broadening our horizons and making us think for a moment before we invest now. Really, invaluable takeaways we have, all of us, from this session. And thank you for accepting to address us today. Thank you so much. Despite your busy schedule, your pressing schedule, we all understand. But you took time out and you are with us today. It's a huge privilege, a huge honor for all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and keep up the great work you're all doing. All the very best.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Rajan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.